So today I have the pleasure of speaking with Tayler Zavitz about animal activism, its current criminalization, and its connections with feminism. Tayler Zavitz is a PhD candidate and instructor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. So she works in the areas of political sociology and social movements with a focus on the animal advocacy movement. She also has a master's degree in critical sociology with a focus on critical animal studies from Brock University. So thank you, Tayler, for agreeing to do this interview with me. Can you start by introducing yourself and saying a bit about your work, what the work you've done and continue to do both as an activist and as a scholar of activism?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this interview. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. As you mentioned, yeah, I'm a PhD candidate and instructor in the Department of Sociology at UVic. My background in academia was mainly in critical sociology with a specific focus in critical animal studies. But I also do have a background in political science and public law as well. My activism started about, I would say, like 15 years ago, and I've been active in a variety of like grassroots activism campaigns, doing like local outreach and advocacy, going to protests, doing speaking engagements and that sort of thing. I've also worked with a number of large animal organizations, doing organizing and taking part in like slaughterhouse vigils, traveling to set up organization chapters in other places in the world, like in the US, for example, working on undercover investigations. So I've kind of had my hands in a lot of different areas of activism over the years. And my academic career as a scholar of activism really kind of followed from getting involved with activism myself and really learning about activist repression that was taking place. Specifically at that time, it was going on in the US through things like ag legislation and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I really started to kind of dive into that area of research, and then wanted to uncover like what was happening in Canada in that respect. And from there, that's kind of really where my PhD work comes in now. And that work continues to have that critical animal studies foundation, because it's an area of academia that, while definitely expanding and growing with each year, it's still often widely ignored or almost like diminished as a legitimate field of study, despite the fact that these issues, the large scale like animal suffering and exploitation that we're seeing, while obviously important on their own, also intersects with so many other social justice issues, right? So I think education is so important. I honestly believe that a great deal of people are really just ignorant to what's actually happening to animals. And I really do see this through my teaching all the time. People really just have no real knowledge about, animal industries and the reality of what's happening. And so for me, a big part of my decision to pursue my academic path was kind of twofold. One, simply to educate, to create that space within academic discussions to highlight the reality that animals are facing. And then second, to work within the system to help legitimize the field of critical animal studies and push for a more truly like inclusive education system.
Thank you. So what are some of the ways in which animal activism has been criminalized and repressed that you examine in your research?
Yeah. So I kind of look at my research in two different kind of ways. I look at the criminalization in terms of the legal criminalization, so actual legislation, actual criminalization through the criminal justice system. So that would be things like the ag laws that have now come up in Canada as well as like eco-terrorism, labeling of activists as terrorists under the legal system, or the use of, we don't have eco-terrorist legislation currently in Canada, like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the United States, for example, but that rhetoric still being pushed throughout the criminal justice system as well. So I look at these sorts of cases of activists being legitimately charged and convicted, right? If that's the case. So, like the example of Anita back in 2015 is one case that I look at, looking at how, in that specific example, she was giving water to a pig on a slaughter truck, and she was charged with criminal mischief, right? And faced heavy fines and jail time for doing so. She was acquitted of that, but that was a long legal process that she had to go through. And so there's a number of cases like that in Canada that I've looked at where activists have been criminalized under the current legislation. So whether that's things like criminal mischief or trespassing, those sorts of laws that we had on the books at the time that were being used to try and silence or deter activists from taking part in those sorts of activities. Most cases that I've looked at have been acquitted or haven't actually gone forward. One that is different is the case of the Excelsior 4, which went forward, and Amy Serrano and Nick Schaefer were both charged and convicted. And that was really the first time that we've seen activists who have actually been convicted and sentenced, right, to dealing with these sorts of cases. And in that case, it was specific to a Meet the Victims event that they took part in here in BC. And so that's kind of been one side of my research, is looking at how the legal system and the criminal justice system is kind of moving forward in terms of criminalizing animal activists to try and silence them, to try and deter them from taking part in these sorts of activities. But the other side of that is the ideological side that I'm looking at in terms of the criminalization. And that's just through things like education systems, through media, through these ideological ways of talking about animal activists. And that really comes down to things like language and the rhetoric that's used to talk about animal activists, and how that specific sort of criminalization, just through ideology and through our understandings of animal activists, are criminalizing them far before they even get to the criminal justice system. And so this conversation about, how media is representing animal activists, for example, and how that then perpetuates a specific idea about who they are, the actions that they do. And so it's an interesting kind of dynamic, because I think a lot of the time we're looking at, or when we're talking about these issues of criminalization, it's often talking about that specific legal system, because it is so problematic in terms of things like ag legislation, and something that obviously we have to be concerned about. But I think that tends to be the focus because of those strict sort of punishments that are being implemented. But I think an important conversation that isn't often seen or talked about as often is that ideological conversation around animal activists that has created the situation for these sorts of legal actions to be taken in the first place, right? And so it's this idea that this notion of eco-terrorism, this like fear-mongering that's created, this moral panic that's created through this sort of rhetoric, that this is some sort of, really the ideology is really just to protect the animal industrial complex, right? It's a specific idea that's promoted, specific narrative that's told in order to create this sort of panic to silence the critics of this industry.
And do you have personal experiences of activists being criminalized, either yourself or people you know?
Yeah, I mean, ideologically, absolutely, right? Like everyone that I know that's involved really in the movement. But yeah, I mean, I have had two family members of mine who have been, kind of personally criminalized. One was my sister, who was protesting a Ministry of Natural Resources conducted deer hunt in our local town. And she was standing in front of a driveway where the ministry trucks were all trying to come out, and people were protesting and standing with signs in front of the driveway. And this specific ministry worker didn't want to wait anymore and ended up using his vehicle to push her across the street out of the way. And it was all on film, video of it. Luckily, she was not overly physically harmed in that situation, which we're all very grateful for. But in that situation, when there was talks afterwards of charges being laid against that specific ministry worker, the police in that situation really pushed forward how my sister could be charged for criminal mischief for standing in front of the driveway. And so it was just this interesting kind of conversation around, something as serious as like vehicular assault versus somebody standing with a sign, much like you would see with like a labor picket, right? Like standing in front of a driveway, just blocking access. And that sort of being the main focus in that specific case. And that in this conversation, I will say, like, that's not me advocating for the use of the criminal justice system, like for punishment. I believe in decarcerization and moving away from the criminal justice system. But I think, my point to that is just to highlight the inconsistencies and the discrepancy of like how the system is used, who's criminalized and who is not, right? Somebody who is just openly willing to hit somebody with a vehicle, that's seen as, fine, and somebody standing with a sign is not, right? And then in the same event or the same protest that's taking place, my father was actually arrested and charged with assault of a Ministry of Natural Resources worker, despite the fact that the entire thing was on film and he was nowhere near the individual when he says that this took place. And so in that situation, my father, who is somebody who is well known and very well respected in his community and has served his community in healthcare and community work for, decades, had to go be fingerprinted and put in a jail cell while he awaited these charges to talk to somebody about what was going on. And, I think for me, that was something that I was probably the most angry at the system at the time, but I was also the most proud of him for standing up against an industry that will do whatever they can to try and silence those who are standing up against what they're doing. And so I think in, those specific situations, and those are just two directly related to me, but those just speak volumes in terms of what evidence you can have, what you can show to have happened or not have happened, and the things that will still go forward despite that, based on the power of these sorts of industries. And I mean, luckily the charges against my father were eventually dropped, but same sort of idea, like it's creating that fear, wasting time, wasting money for these individuals and wrapping them up in a system that is very scary.
So the type of animal activism that tends to be criminalized as eco-terrorism is usually direct action activism, and in some cases, direct action activism that breaks the law, for instance, by trespassing onto farms. Although in the examples you just gave, there was your sister and your father weren't doing anything illegal. And your research also shows the legislation is so broad that people could potentially be targeted just by happening to witness cruelty to animals that is protected under ag laws. So there are forms of animal advocacy that do not even break the law, however, or are not direct action activism. And in these cases, animal advocates tend to be stigmatized in other ways as crazy or hysterical, for instance, and it tends to be sort of feminized. So what role do you see gender playing in these different forms of activism and the ways they are undermined?
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of a situation at a circus protest, and this was like a number of years ago, that I was at, where I was protesting with a group of individuals at this circus that comes through town like once a year. And as I was standing there, a man was yelling at me for protesting the event, and told me that I should be at home cooking dinner for my husband. And I remember just that, like, stopping and just being like, what? Like, why is that the automatic sort of response, right? And I think gender definitely plays a role in, like you're saying, the way animal activism is stigmatized as being like overly sentimental, right? Or overly emotional or weak, right? And it is feminized, right? It's seen as lesser than because of those things. And, of course, women care about animals because we're too emotional and need to like toughen up about the reality of the world, right? And so this sort of rhetoric is consistent in terms of talking about animal activism. And so I think because of that, it's often not taken seriously or seen as like irrational, right? I think it's kind of passed off as a, like bleeding heart movement that doesn't actually hold any sort of legitimacy.
So animal activism has been critiqued for using tactics, images, and comparisons that are experienced as racist, sexist, fatphobic, and otherwise oppressive to minoritized groups of humans. So I'm thinking especially of PETA ads that compare animal oppression to the Holocaust and human enslavement, the save the whales, lose the blubber, go vegetarian PETA ad that obviously exploits discrimination against fat people to advance their cause. The recent ad that appropriates a symbol of Black Lives Matter by showing animals taking a knee, and then the frequent use of female nudity to promote veganism also in PETA ads. So animal activists have also been critiqued for targeting the practices of minoritized groups, the eating of shark fin soup, for instance. What are your thoughts on these forms of animal activism and these kinds of charges of racism and sexism within animal activism?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think the movement has often done itself a serious disservice by taking part in some of these sorts of campaigns. I think they can show, a real disregard and an insensitivity for the suffering and oppression that human beings have gone through and continue to go through. And, some of them, like these, blatantly fat phobic or sexist or racist ads, in my opinion, have no place in a movement that's based on compassion and equality, right? The whole idea behind veganism and the animal rights movement is this idea of like having compassion, having that idea of equality, having that moving forward of ideology to be progressive, right? And these sorts of campaigns are taking us back, right? Like they're not doing anything other than further oppressing others to try and promote not oppressing animals, which like it doesn't add up. I think, there are campaigns like you're talking about the Holocaust campaigns, which I know, or slavery campaigns, which are like fairly popular with PETA. And I think those people often struggle with seeing why they're problematic because there are connections between oppression, right? And I think people want to try and get people to understand those connections. But I think there's other ways of doing that aren't problematic and aren't overtly potentially offensive to those who have struggled themselves. And especially, when we see examples of, white activists doing like street outreach and going up to like a person of color and saying like, well, like animals deal with things like slavery, and having like no understanding of what that actually means to that individual, right? And so this sort of like real insensitivity that's really, I think, prevalent in the movement. And I think that also comes from a place of ignorance and a place of not understanding those connections or understanding other social justice movements. So, as a movement, we, like the animal rights movement, should and need to be allies of other social justice movements. We should be helping to fight alongside them and raising our voices in support of social equality, not being the ones contributing to further inequality.
Thank you. So although it's easy to criticize PETA ads such as these, in an interview for Plant Powered Radio, you mentioned that it was a PETA video that made you go vegetarian. And you also said that it was the film Earthlings that made you go from a passive vegetarian to an angry and active vegan, promising to do everything in your power to improve the lives of animals. So both of those experiences show the impact that media can have. And in your article, Animal Oppression and Solidarity, Examining Representations of Animals and Their Allies in 21st Century Media, You explore representations of the Animal Liberation Front in media. What are your thoughts on the Animal Liberation Front in particular and how they have been depicted in the media, both negatively and more rarely positively? And maybe first you can sort of say a little bit about the Animal Liberation Front and the sorts of tactics they use.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just on the conversation of PETA. I mean, it is easy to criticize and critique PETA for the problematic things that they do. And I also think it's important to do so. That's how we grow and evolve as a movement and become more effective. But, you know, at the same time, I can also acknowledge that they have done important work throughout their history as an organization. And some of that work, like you said, directly impacted me and made me at the young age of 12 say that I would never eat animals again. And so, yeah, I mean, I do believe media is very impactful. And, you know, that can be in like a good way or a bad way. And we can definitely see that specifically around activists like in the ALF. Personally, I support direct action work. You know, I have a great deal of respect for those who put their lives and freedom on the line to save the lives of animals and disrupt these horrifically violent industries. I know they're often seen as, you know, controversial, and some argue that they make like the movement as a whole look bad, or create like a specific idea about the movement as a whole. But I think that in itself really speaks to the power of media, because that's how media has framed the ALF. You know, I've done a great deal of archival research for my dissertation, and looking at specifically like newspaper clippings of what was going on with animal activists throughout its history in Canada. And you know, throughout the 80s and 90s in Canada, there was a number of ALF actions that were taking place. And the media really had like a field day with them. You know, you saw language like lunatics or dangerous radicals, thieves, criminals, militants, extremists, kidnappers, terrorists, right? Like this is the sort of common rhetoric that we were seeing. And usually that was alongside the photo of like an activist wearing a balaclava to like create this like very like kind of scary picture, right? And so, and one actual example that I can think of that comes to mind is this was in like the mid 80s, like 1985, there was a monkey who was liberated by the ALF from a laboratory at the University of Western Ontario. And after the liberation took place, the laboratory came out and said that the monkey could be infected with a herpes virus that was deadly to humans. And so the narrative then that was prevalent throughout the media was this fear mongering about the ALF now putting the public in danger and like spreading this disease. So, you know, they weren't just criminals anymore, but now they were a public health risk, right? And so most media representation of the ALF is not positive, right? Like it often highlights things like theft and breaking and entering and having to get an increase of security and people feeling threatened or unsafe. And there's typically a general disregard for like the real issue at hand, which is like the animals that were liberated in those situations, right? And I mean, I can't say that's always the case. Like there are some articles that I found where there was like a somewhat like sympathetic kind of tone to the issue in terms of like the animals, but they were still pretty harsh, like in terms of the activists themselves. And so I think when it came to these two specific medias that I was talking about in the article, that being Okja, the film, and the book, We're All Completely Beside Ourselves, I think they stood out to us so much because it was like a complete flip of the narrative around the ALF, which like you just don't commonly see. So, I mean, in Okja, for example, there's like a full scene where ALF activists are explicitly outlining like their philosophies and their codes that they follow. And really it was taken directly, almost word for word from like ALF press literature, right? And so for the first time, you really had this kind of like actual understanding of who the ALF are in their own words, as opposed to what the media was creating for them. And in Fowler's book, we also see these like accurate depictions of how and why the ALF operate. She talks about real life historical context, talking about different liberations that have taken place throughout the ALF's history, and also outlines like descriptions of horrendous treatment of animals within these animal industries. So again, creating a very different narrative, and a very accurate narrative of what's actually taking place. So, these two examples really kind of set the stage for this like undeniable rethinking of the ALF and who they are and what they do. There was also a clear highlighting in both of the ALF and how they're deemed as terrorists, and really the absurdity of those labels as well. As we say in the article, like those that are engaging with the film or reading the book, they're ultimately exposed to like the reality that animal activists like aren't these violent criminals or terrorists, but rather they're like compassionate individuals who are like motivated by things like empathy and justice, right? And in a world where we're seeing through the mainstream media that activists are typically villainized or called these specific words to create this sort of fear around them, these media sources do the opposite. They humanize them, right? They make them relatable. They highlight these sorts of inconsistencies in this sort of unfounded characterization and expose the reality of who these people are.
Thank you. In the same article, you draw on the work of Timothy Pachurat, who spent 6 months working in a slaughterhouse in order to write a book on the topic, Every 12 Seconds, Industrialized Slaughter and the Politics of Sight. Animal advocates working for PETA have also gone undercover in slaughterhouses with hidden cameras to expose the horrors of these places. What do you think of forms of critical animal research and activism that involve going undercover in slaughterhouses or into other sites of animal oppression, and even participating in the killing of animals with the objective of ultimately exposing that violence to the public?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I often say, and like similar to how I feel about direct action in terms of like the ALF, I'm somebody who believes that a variety of tactics is necessary in order to really push the movement forward. I think some things that some will find problematic or they don't necessarily agree with, like direct action, for example, because it's breaking the law. Others will see that, and that will be what impacts them the most and changes their ideology about these sorts of issues. And so I think there's room for all sorts of tactics in the movement, as long as those tactics are not like oppressing somebody else by doing so, right? Like these ads that we're talking about. I think in terms of undercover work, I worked for an organization who did undercover investigations. I saw the impact that those investigations had on people when they came out into the mainstream media. I think it's something that's important in terms of seeing something that is so hidden. It's something that we do not typically have the availability to see. We don't have the opportunity to have these sorts of conversations over legitimate, what's the word I'm looking for? Like looking at it from the actual animal's point of view, seeing it from what their actual experience is. We hear about it kind of on a periphery when we talk about these sorts of issues oftentimes. And we can tell somebody about these sorts of things. We can tell people about the suffering that's taking place or what animals are going through. But I think seeing it is a completely different situation for people. And like I said, that's what changed me. And having gone to farms and gone to slaughterhouses in the US and Canada, there was times where I would have my phone recording or live streaming at the time, and the impact that had on people that I knew, right? Just in my own kind of small circle of people who I had been talking about veganism to for years and who never really paid attention to it. I think there's something very powerful in bearing witness to those animals in that time in their life. I think it's got its pros and cons. I think there's, obviously, taking part in the killing of animals is an issue, but it's also something that I know some who have worked in those specific situations doing undercover work, who I've talked to in length about these sorts of issues, have said, like, it's going to happen whether I'm there or not. And in some aspects, they preferred that they were the one to do it because they would be kinder. And so it's, you know, a situation where, is it important to have that footage? I think so. And is it important to be able to be in those spaces? I think it is, but obviously that's going to come with problems on its own.
A number of feminist critical animal studies scholars have pointed out that since the 19th century, anti-vivisection and vegetarian movements, more women than men have been engaged in animal advocacy and are vegetarian or vegan. At the same time, men are overrepresented as the leaders of the movement, with Peter Singer dubbed as the father. So many animal rights organizations are headed by men, even while women do most of the work, although PETA is an exception. So what do you think, or why do you think it is that more women than men are vegan and advocate for animals? And why do you think men nonetheless lead the movement, or at least head many of its organizations, and are the most influential authors? Has this been your own experience in animal advocacy and scholarship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I find it interesting, or ironic rather, you know, that even in a movement that, as we talked about earlier, is often like feminized, seen as like emotional or rational or weak because of the fact that it's mostly women, that men still hold the powerful positions. And, you know, I mean, I think if that's not the patriarchy at work, like, I don't know what is, right? It's just, I think, that overarching system that we can see play out. I think socialization obviously plays a role here. If we look back to, you know, childhood socialization all the way up to current socialization within society, you know, boys, men socialized to be like tough, uncaring, unfeeling, aggressive, strong, take part in violence, right? To be tough. The sort of rhetoric of, you know, eating animals is masculine, it's tough. Killing animals, like hunting, that makes you tough. This sort of thing is perpetuated consistently within society. And then on the flip side, obviously, we come back to this idea that, you know, girls and women are socialized to be inferior or caregivers, right? Maternal. Eating plants is weak, it's feminine, right? So, I mean, this sort of socialization obviously plays a role in why more women than men are vegan and take part in animal activism. I think in terms of, if we look at like the men still like leading the movement or being heads of organization or getting the most attention in terms of their activist work, as I said, I do think like the patriarchal system is still at play here, just in general. Like, there's still an undertone of women not being good enough to hold these positions. There's still a lot of men in powerful positions who use these positions to exploit and target women. And we've seen that play out in our movement as well. And I think, you know, that's another reason why it's so important for our movement to understand and align our values with other social justice movements to try and eliminate some of this that's taking place. And I also think that it's often because women aren't generally promoting themselves the way that men do. I think currently in a time of a technological age and a time of social media, we see a lot of activist work online. And I think a lot of those women who are doing the work aren't the ones that are plastering their faces on social media. They're not sitting back and you know, spending hours editing videos of themselves to promote themselves. Like, they're typically behind the scenes. They're doing the hard labor. They're doing the work, the difficult work that is often unrecognized and is often then used by these individuals to promote themselves. And so, you know, it's so common that folks in the mainstream animal rights movement look at this history of the movement as only including, like you're saying, like Peter Singer or like James Aspey and Earthling Ed, because they're the ones that have the most media attention. And really, this is like an absolute disservice to the movement and to those who have done the work before them. And I mean, not only is it just like overtly problematic because it's like a blatant, inaccurate, and flawed representation of our movement, and one that obviously lacks like serious insight and important pivotal moments, but it also completely erases the incredible work that's been done, and continues to be done by so many women and women of color specifically. Just as a starting point, like Jill Phipps, Abreeze Harper, Carol J. Adams, Liz White, Leslie Bisgold, Manisha Deka, Twyla Francois, AFCO, Lori Gruen, Patrice Jones, Joanne MacArthur. Like, this is just to name a few, right? And they're the ones that you don't typically hear about because they're the ones that are just busy doing the work. And so I think a lot of what this does is simply like upholds this male saviorism, and usually white male saviorism that is already so rampant in this movement. And not to mention that, most of these men in these higher positions or that are promoted often still promote these sorts of oppressive views and problematic individuals, right? That these individuals or ideas that are using things like these PETA campaigns, these really problematic, overtly sexist or racist campaigns. And so, that creates a problem in itself. And so there needs to be this focus on that intersection of ideology and social justice movements. And I think, our actual history of this movement has so much depth to it, so many crucial individuals and turning points, and promoting it in such a simplistic way is, not only offensive to all of those who came before us and who created and shaped the movement to what it is today, but also who, just because they fought tirelessly and still do, to try and push the movement forward.
Thank you. Since the 19th century, many women and animal advocates have been feminists and have connected their advocacy to their animal advocacy to their feminism. Is your own animal advocacy connected to your feminism, or is your feminism connected to your animal advocacy?
Yeah, I would say my feminism really emerged because of my animal activism, and learning about the connection between the oppression of animals and the oppression of women. I think becoming involved in animal advocacy work, and then having the opportunity at the time to be at a university that had one of the only critical animal studies programs in Canada, I was like suddenly immersed in learning about the world of inequality and oppression and violence. And at the same time, the world of social justice work. And so having that opportunity to learn about and engage with these intersecting issues, like reading the work of Carol J. Adams and Manisha Deka and those who are working in these fields, having also faced oppression myself based on being a woman, I was then really easily able to see that connection. And I would say that that's where my feminism really flourished.
Thank you. So my last question is, although there's a strong historical and conceptual relationship between feminism and animal advocacy, in my own life, I've never experienced so much pushback against my veganism and animal advocacy as I have from feminists. Although much less discussed, I think these conversations about animals within feminism might parallel the fraught discussions of race with white feminists, where a group that is used to identifying as the social justice warriors and the oppressed or the allies of the oppressed is very uncomfortable finding themselves situated on the side of the oppressors and the privileged in terms of this issue. So what are your experiences as an animal activist in feminist academic spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's very similar. For those feminists that are outside of the critical animal studies space, obviously, I mean, I think for me as well, I came from, like I said, Brock University that had this critical animal studies program. I came from a department that was, even those who weren't engaged with critical animal studies understood it. And it was something that was just accepted. It was normalized. And I think leaving that kind of little bubble was a bit of a rude awakening for me when I moved and got into a new department. And I was very surprised that those who were the most dismissive, or those that I had kind of the most butting heads with about issues, weren't the people that I thought they would be. I had a number of professors who had zero real interest in animal issues or knew much about animal issues, who were very supportive of the work that I was doing, whereas feminist scholars were the opposite. And it was very confronting for me. I was put in a situation where I had multiple well-known feminist theorists who were extremely dismissive and condescending about the work that I was doing, to the point that, we had an individual come to do a guest lecture in our feminist theory class, who's a very well-known feminist theorist. And I asked her a question about how she navigated. She was talking about how she created new language within her department to talk about women's issues at the time, like many years previously, and how, difficult it was and how she struggled with it and all of these issues. And I was really thinking at the time of how similar it was in terms of how I had to approach departments, for example, and how I had to have these conversations and try and recreate a specific language around animals. And I asked a question about, how did you overcome that? Like, what was your way through that? Like, how did you navigate that? Because, this is something similar to what I'm doing. And the response that I got, still to this day, kind of really shocks me, in that it was just completely like condescending. And I was basically told like the research that I was doing like was invalid, like it didn't matter. And I just kind of couldn't believe how there was such clear parallels between the work that they did and the struggles that they had, and the work and struggles that I had, and that there was nothing. There was no conversation that took place about like, oh yeah, like, let's talk about this, or let's see how we can move this forward. It was just very much like, what you're doing is irrelevant. And I think it does stem from this kind of feeling of being called out, right? And not even me actually verbally calling out, but just my presence of calling out the fact that there were things that they were taking part in that could be seen as hypocritical with what they're promoting or what they're advocating for in their own work. And so I do think that, and I think similar to how defensive people can get when you talk to them about eating animals, whether they're like feminist scholar or not, I think it just is confronting to people because they have to acknowledge their own practices. They have to acknowledge their the things that they're doing that's contributing. And I think especially, as you said, those who consider themselves these very strong allies and those who are dedicated to social justice, to have to then deal with that dilemma of, okay, well, now I'm the one that's actually taking part in that. I think that's very confronting for people. And I think it's something that I think it makes people very uncomfortable. And I think that tends to be why you get that kind of feedback from those who you would maybe least expect it from.
Thank you so much. That was all my questions. Do you have any final remarks or anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I would like thank you again for inviting me to have this chat. And I think, these issues are so important and oftentimes don't have a simple answer. And so I think it's, so important to continue to have these conversations and critically discuss, how to move forward as a movement to be as effective as we possibly can.
Thank you.